Okay, then very quickly, let's just finish off before we delve into Jeff Chaucer again, with a few thoughts about universities. Since we are ourselves here gathered together at a modern university, let's have a look at the origins of that concept in medieval Europe as it was. Until about AD 1200, maybe a little bit before, okay, most learning, transmission of learning and education was primarily focused on religious institutions, monasteries, cathedral schools, and so on. This is the reason why people often say, oh, the church had this terrible control over learning and seemed to want to keep everyone else stupid or whatever, rather than the fact that if the church wasn't doing that, then everyone would be stupid. But here at least was a small minority of people who had time and inclination to pass on the learning and so on, which is how I'd like to see it myself, rather than in a negative way. But there's no denying that, to a large extent, intellectual activity of one sort or another was going on in churches, and to a large extent therefore, but not exclusively, was focusing on one way or another religious issues, but not always, of course. However, perhaps in the late 12th century and into the 13th century, a little bit earlier in one or two cases, we do then see the emergence of new intellectual centres, which are still in one way or another part of the church system, in terms of its personnel, but are, on the other hand, to some degree independent from church hierarchy. And these separate schools develop in different places, are the origins of what we call universities. Now, we mentioned the word universitas before, which Alp was mentioning that one earlier on. That's one of the terms. But again, like in the case of the guilds or whatever, there are various other words which were used. Studium is one of these. Collegium that I mentioned before. Facultas, faculty. They were all described in various ways. But today we use the concept of university as a way of kind of grouping them all together. So, the main distinction is not that somehow the universities were secular and were focusing on necessarily secular, non-religious things, because most of the people, or all the people in a sense, who were members of the university, whether they were the teachers or the students, were all part of the church hierarchy. They were clergymen, they were clericos, clerics, which we get the English word clerk, okay? But they had their own separate association, legal identity, okay? And that's the important thing which makes them different from a monastic school or a cathedral school, which was part of that church and was therefore controlled by that church, and so on. So it's their identity, it's their situation, legal situation, which is to some extent different from the others. Okay, one of you did the essay on universities? I can't remember who did the essay on universities. Is it he or she here? I don't remember who it was now. Obviously not. Alp, you gave a presentation a few years ago on universities. Is that right? Or for me, whatever. I don't want to put you on the spot and say, cast your mind back 3 years or however long it was, but feel free to make any comments. I won't ask you to give a lecture now. We don't have the time either for you and me to go on long. But if you want to add anything else to what I'm saying, then we can kind of share it, because it would be nice to get your perspective. So by the late Middle Ages, we can kind of talk about universities, and there is a certain identity, a certain character which continues into the early modern period. Before then, when they emerge from different places for different reasons and different ways. So, for example, in Italy, one of the earliest and most important, what we would call universities, perhaps as late as the end of the 11th century, was at Bologna, and this was particularly associated with the study of law, which is a little bit outside the focus of the church, but the church is interested in law as well. But it produced jurists who would work in the church, but might also work in as lawyers and within government and administration, things like that. Okay, and this is perhaps the prime law school, as you want to call that, in the Middle Ages. In the south of Italy, in Sicily, in Salerno, again, maybe as late as the 11th century, we see the development of the medical school there. So again, not something we automatically associate with the church, the study of medicine, but very, very important there. In Paris, perhaps originally growing out of the cathedral school at the big church at Notre Dame, we see the University of Paris emerging during the 12th century at some point, and this was more than anything else associated with theology. And of course the English universities also emerging a little bit later. Alp, which one came first? Do you remember, Oxford or Cambridge? Oxford came first, traditionally seen as a kind of a bunch of the scholars from Paris running over and setting up shop. Cambridge, yeah, that's the, I don't know exact details of these things, but in many places, of course, many medieval towns where you have universities emerging, you do get a certain degree of, what's the word, antagonism between the university and the rest of the town. On an individual basis, you know, people who are not at the university don't like students and they might fight them and things like that. But in terms of organising things, the town administration, whatever, will often find it difficult to have this very big and quite powerful organisation in its midst over which it has not much control. So at various times, town administrations, or perhaps in the case of Paris, bishops and so on, will be arguing with the university, and some people might then move on elsewhere. And so we get the emergence of Oxford and then Cambridge. And during the central into 13th and 14th centuries, then you get universities, as we can call them now, appearing elsewhere in Europe as well. But these are the big ones, in a sense, the earliest ones that we know of. Alp, what about the organisation of these universities, these earliest ones? The structure of them. To some extent, there's a kind of two models that they follow. Can you remember? Sorry?
Colleges, like different colleges. Was it around one instructor or master?
Yeah, okay. Well, if we think again of them as kind of guilds, intellectual fraternities or whatever, then the two models that we see in different places is either the students are the focus, so the organisation is based around the students, and the students create some kind of an identity, and then the professors, the masters, as they are called there as well, are teaching and fitting in with that. Or else it's the instructors, it's the masters who form the legal core of it, and the students kind of fit around. So there are two models, two structures in a sense going on, and depending on which pattern you get, then the relations and the organisation can vary quite a lot and so on. But again, you have this idea of reaching the stage of the status of master when you have passed a certain number of qualifications, very similar in that sense to the guild, and that's why we still have the concept of, in English, the MA, the Master of Arts, or the MSc, the Master of Science, and so on.
We see in this medieval, among the medieval intellectuals, they try to make peace with the science or philosophy, with the Christianity, for example, in philosophy. And there are Thomas Aquinas and Saint Alphon try to make peace, the mixture of the Platonism, Aristotelianism with the Christianity and something like that. So can we make a certain generalization of these universities, like all of them have somehow more or less related with the church, or is there some universities which totally independent from the church? try to make something different?
Well, legally, they were, I would think, independent of the church. That's why in Paris, as I said, you get the Bishop of Paris arguing with what becomes the university there and so on. So they have their own identity, their own corporate identity, like a guild or something. And again, being in the town, they have this ability to get these freedoms from outside control, to a large extent. But most of the people who went to university, attended university and were teaching at university in the Middle Ages were members of the church. They were people who were ordained or begun to become ordained or in the process of becoming priests of one sort or another. Okay? Many of them would then pursue different skills, but they were still part of the church. So there's a kind of yes and no to that one. Okay? They're not being controlled by the church. I wouldn't say controlled necessarily, but they are part of the church, but they're not in an official way, but not in a sense being controlled. They had their own identity, which is why we have people running away to elsewhere to set up their own freedom and things like that. But they are at this point working with people who are members of the church. They are young people and they do all the things that young people do, and they're fighting and arguing and getting drunk and all these things or whatever. They're not kind of just going around praying all the time, but they are still clerks in one sort or another, part of the clerical order, yeah. I'm worrying about the time here. Okay, Al?
Yeah, the American universities is a bit interesting because up until, cathedral schools are established, there comes the name scholasticism. Education is done, or intellectual discourse is done in monasteries. And the reason why these church schools, to the extent that you are concerned with kind of intellectual activity, the reason why they kind of start establishing their own schools, because monasteries really are no longer interested in, to an extent, in what is called the secular sciences, things like logic and arithmetic and geometry and stuff like that. And in order to become a master, to study theology or medicine or law, you have to first do a Bachelor of Arts, which means you have to be fluent in, or capable in these seven arts. Now, there were a bunch of medieval philosophers who got quite carried away with the logic and dialectic, as it were, and came to say quite radical things when you think of them in theological terms. And even though the church might not have had a direct kind of control, perhaps, so in that sense universities were independent or autonomous, these persons that I referred to got into quite trouble. Abelard, for instance, is an example. Maybe you can look up Abelard. He has a very, very interesting story. He has been a very famous instructor at the University of Paris, but later on, because of some of the stuff he said, he got a bunch of people quite upset, and then he got kicked out, and so on, stuff like that.
Yeah. And my last, that's a good point. And my last thing that I was going to say was, because I'm trying to be quick here, but we were talking about the Carolingian Renaissance again, Alp, a few weeks ago, and you mentioned briefly there with reference to the 12th century Renaissance, which we've mentioned a few times, this revival or growing of intellectual activity, partly helped by input from the Islamic culture in Spain and so on. And what we do see is not surprising that during the same time we get these new intellectual institutions emerging, probably very much part of the Renaissance of that time and part of the general flowering of intellectual activity and this degree of independence that we're talking about as well, which can sometimes get you into trouble, as you say. And as I said, I think we ought to think, to some extent, of the universities as these kind of intellectual guilds, in a way, because the structure is not too dissimilar, and the process of going through training and things like that, and the corporate identity is very important as well. Okay, get your Chaucer out then. We have about 20 minutes to look at a few more of Chaucer's characters in the Canterbury Tales. Now, Emre was asking if I wanted to keep the the screen up, which in the light of what I'm going to do now, we could have done, because then we could have put, no, it's okay, we'll forget about it, we won't worry about it. We can put the text up, but it'll take too long to call it up through Moodle. So I noticed that the line numbers in my edition are about 2 lines behind what you have. So when I pick a character, and I'll say go to line this, then you probably need to look at about 2 or 3 lines lower down, you'll find what you want. Let's, okay, on 2 successive characters here, fit in with our urban focus. So can you go to line, I think it's 272. It's 270 in mine, but 272 for you. The merchant. We got that? And I don't know if, was there anyone who was not here on Friday? We did a very brief summary of Middle English grammar, the main points, and I posted my guide to that on Moodle, which you may or may not have looked at. So please put your hand up if you don't understand something that we look at here. Most of the words, as I said before, you can more or less just read in modern English form, and they make, to some extent, sense, but there may be a few funny forms that you might not work out. Okay, a merchant was there with a forked beard. In mottoley and hay on horse he sat. Upon his head a floundrish beaver hat. His bootes clasped fair and fetisly. His raisons he spake full solemnly, sounding alway the increase of his winning. He would the sea were kept for anything betwixt Middlesbrough and Orwell. Well could he in exchange shield sell. This worthy man full well his wit beset. There wist no wit that was in debt. So stately was he in his governance, with his bargains and with his chevisance. Forsooth he was a worthy man withal, but sooth to say I noot how men him call. Right, that's the merchant. And remember we said before, the merchants were the kind of aristocracy of the urban socio-economic revival of the Central and later Middle Ages. And a lot of what's said in here suggests that. Okay. There was a merchant with what? Forked beard, yes. Now, you may have seen these images of people where they grow little beards that stick out little 2 prongs there, which is must have been some kind of a stereotype of style or something like that. In mottoley, which I've written here, different coloured, multicoloured clothing. So he had a mixture of colours and so on, okay, which again is showing his style. And high on horse he sat on his, he had a horse, okay, and he's sitting very high there. Upon his head a Flandrous beaver hat. Beaver, the skin, the wool of a beaver, okay, from Flanders. His boots clasped fair and fetisly neatly. His reasons he spoke full solemnly. Any ideas of this one, and this line? Reasons here may not mean literally the reason, why you're doing something, just his ideas, his thoughts. Solemnly, we say in English. Seriously, yes. He wants to be taken serious, you know. He's an important guy. I'm rich. Talking a little bit slowly and, no, shh. And he'll say his bit. And everyone will kind of like that or whatever. Okay. He thinks quite highly of himself in that sense. Sounding always the increase of his winning. Now this is interesting. What we have here, I suspect, the increase, but for poetic or whatever reasons, Chaucer has run the 2 vowels together, so we get the increase becomes the increase. Okay. In stereotypical Northern English, for example, you can say, oh, give me t'other one, which is a short form of the other one. Okay, it's the same thing. I say that to my children sometimes, give me t'other one, and whatever, but that's just an affectation on my part. So there is the increase of his winning. I suspect winning here doesn't mean kind of You know, he's running faster than Serkan or something like that. Oh, I'm the winner. But it's got the same meaning as kazanmak in Turkish, to win or to earn. So he's saying, oh, my boats came in last week, you know, a couple of thousand pounds or shillings and things like that or whatever, and everyone's saying, oh, he's a very impressive guy. He's always making sure that people know how wealthy and so on he is. Okay. He would, the sea were kept for anything betwixt. Okay. Two meanings of the English word will. Will means future tense. We will be finishing the class soon, hooray. Will also means
desire.
Desire. Okay, I will that. If we put it in the past tense, then I would that. Here it means I wish that. So it meant he wanted the sea, you know, basically to be there for his trade in that sense. Okay. Well could he in exchange shieldes sell shields. I'm not sure what the significance of the reference to shields is, but they're probably quite important and so on. West, wicht means man. White there, okay, is a man. So stately in his governance, that his bargains and with his chevesons, borrowings there, okay, borrowing and so on. Forsooth a worthy man, but sooth means truth, okay. Forsooth to say, okay, forsooth to say in here, I noot how men him call, which I take to mean, I don't know what his name was. I spent days with this guy, travelling to Canterbury, listening to him, telling me about his earnings, he told his story, but I'm not sure even what his name was. No, that's interesting. Whether, you know, I don't actually bother to tell you what my name is. Call me sir, kind of thing, or something like that, perhaps.
What about the sea? I couldn't understand that. You know, he would the sea would kept for anything. What he wants to do with the sea?
Well, I think he wants the sea to be. I read this to be, you know, he wishes the sea basically is only for sailing for merchants. Okay. So it's for commercial activities, essentially. Okay. Yeah, and elsewhere, anything. Yeah, he just wants there to be trade, and he doesn't want kings setting off with armadas across the sea, having wars and causing all sorts of trouble. Basically, if everything was just left to us merchants and we did the trade, that would be fine. But we get all these politicians screwing things up or whatever, and things like that.
He specifically mentions two places, like this Middlesbrough and Orwell. So he wants.
Yeah, Middlesbrough is in England on the east coast, and I think it's all well how it is exactly today, but it's somewhere in Holland, something like that. I think it's on the opposite coast, crossing the Channel and the North Sea there. Okay, so that is our big guildsman. Let's now turn to a very different character, the next one. A clerk there was of Oxenford also, that unto logic had long ego, as lean was his horse as is a rake, and he nas not right fat, I undertake. But looked holwe, and thereto soberly. Full threadbare was his overrest courtepy, for he had getten him yet no benefice, ne was no so worldly for to have office. For him was levere, have at his bed's head 20 bookes, clad in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than robes rich or fiddle or gay sautery. And I'll be that he was a philosopher, yet had he but little gold in his coffre. And all that he might of his friendes hent, on bookes and his learning he had spent. And busily gan for the soule's prey of him that yaff him wherewith to scholay. Of study took he most cure and most heed, nocht of words spake he more than was need. And that was said in form and reverence, and short and quick and full of high sentence. Sounding in moral virtue was his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. So there is our clerk, clericus, student from Oxford. All right, what does he What has he got to say about this man, this individual? This is your equivalent. This is the equivalent of all of you from the 14th century. Okay? Sorry? Okay, he doesn't have a lot of money, okay, which is a truism of students throughout the years, okay. Sorry? Well, yes, okay, we'll come back to that in a minute, but firstly, let's stick with this bit here, okay. As lean was his horse as a rake. His horse was very thin. He's not feeding his horse very much, okay. And he nanas right fat, I undertake. And he wasn't very fat either, okay. Now, I was thinner when I was a student. I've put on weight since then as I've earned money or whatever. I suppose that's... nas here is one of these things again, by the way. This is oh, nah. Not was. Okay, ne was, nas. Okay, and again we've got the double negative, which we don't worry about in Middle English. Full threadbare was his overrest courteby, his cape or something. His cape he threw over was very worn and very thin and so on, things like that. Okay. For he had getten him yet no benefice, ne was so wordly for to have office. Benefice, beneficia, kind of. It's a kind of position or a bit of money that you get within the church, okay, a benefice. Usually after you've qualified as, you've become ordained as a priest or whatever, you might get some money from some deal where you might be a priest somewhere or something else. So the benefice is here, the same word is also used for the fief in the feudal society, but here it means ecclesiastical position of some sort, okay? And he wasn't so worldly, he wasn't concerned with just getting office and making money in that sense. So yes, he's poor, and so on, okay? And why is he poor? Why does he have no money? He spends it all on books, doesn't he? Okay. He prefers to have at the head of his bed before he goes to sleep, okay, whatever, black and red books, and Aristotle, as we heard, and other philosophy, than rich robes. Fithel, probably fiddle. I presume, though, whether it refers to the same thing that English, fiddle. What's a fiddle? What instrument is a fiddle these days? Violin, but usually, you know, serious musicians play violins and Irish or country folk players play fiddles or whatever. So whether it means, obviously we didn't have but it's some ancestor of the violin, and psaltery is another stringed instrument, some kind of a zither thing, okay, here, and it means jolly sounding again. We don't have a reference to someone's sexual orientation or whatever with the word gay there, okay. Now, this is, what do you think of this? The next two lines. But all be that he was a philosopher, yet had he but little gold in coffer. Now, why are they contrasting those two lines? He's a philosopher, but he doesn't have much money in his coffers. Now,
doesn't he also go on to say that he's a righteous person? I guess might be contrasting it with that virtue doesn't come with money or gold.
Maybe it's a reference to later on, I suppose. I'm wondering, I don't know what the, whether it's something to do with alchemy here. I think this is what's often interpreted for this here. Alchemy was the medieval science of turning base metals into gold, which perhaps, whether Chaucer believed that possible or not, because we've got the gold mentioned here, so it makes me wonder whether the point is, although he was a philosopher, i.e. he knew about alchemy, he wasn't able to turn the iron into gold or something like that, and so on. But it's playing this point that he's still poor, as we said. Okay, people help him. He's got some kind of people that help him. Okay, all that he might of his friend's hent take from his friends. Whatever he got from his friends, he ended up spending it on books, okay, which is why his horse was thin and he wasn't looking after his clothes and so on. And bitterly began, I guess, for the soulless prey of him, of those that gave him wherewith to scholarly. So anyone who supported his scholarship Basically, he said, you give me the money and I'll pray for your soul. Oh, that sounds, in the Middle Ages, not such a bad exchange, to be honest with you. Some young holy man is going to pray for your soul, then you may well get to heaven and so on. Your soul will be saved. But he's not paying them back, and he's spending it all on scholarship.
We should also try that way in Bilkent.
Sorry?
In order to get more money for the scholarship, maybe we should go and say,
But, yeah,
give us money.
yeah, okay, yeah, that might work or whatever. Of course, these days, people spend their money on laptops and iPads, other mechanisms for learning rather than books, I suspect. We're doing a study in the library at the moment. We're trying to work out, for example, basically, do we have the right tables to accommodate 21st century students? Are they too big or too small? Because people don't sit in a library these days with a couple of books and a notebook. They bring along a laptop. Then they've got to put the bag for the laptop somewhere, as well as having all the old things. And maybe we need to make the tables either bigger or smaller for one person. So a table in the library which is meant to accommodate 4 people usually has 2 people spread all over it with their things. So we're starting to look into that or whatever. So yes, in this days it was a few books, a few manuscripts, of course, rather than printed books. In the modern age we have very different paraphernalia, the things that students need and so on. Okay, what else? Anything else for what we got this thing? Okay. Oh, he's speaking. Okay. Of study took he most cure care, I guess, and most heed, most attention. Naught a word spoke he more than was need. So a bit like the merchant, but perhaps for different reasons. He didn't actually say very much. He was quietish scholar. He didn't speak if it wasn't necessary. And that was said in form and reverence, okay, seriously, and short and quick and full of high sentence, high meaning, in a way. He's probably, where the merchant is trying to make people think he's kind of important guy in the way he talks, probably the scholar is trying to sound a bit clever, okay, and he's mixed all these people who are not so well educated, so he's trying to sound clever. Sounding in moral virtue was his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. Okay. I don't know whether we take anything of that, whether he's just telling people all the time, being a bit intellectual. Elif?
It is compatible with his story, actually, because I think Clark is one of those pilgrims who tells comparatively more virtuous stories.
Right.
Compared to merchant and wife of the other.
So you learn some moral lesson from his story. He's teaching through his story, in a sense, morally.
In terms of being a chaste wife.
Right.
Submissive wife.
Right, okay. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't actually read the Clark story, so I don't know that one, but that's good. Okay, we're going to have to stop there. I see the time has moved on. But there we have 2 characters who we associate with towns to a large extent. The merchant, okay, who's very, very wealthy, and what we would say today, conspicuously consuming. He's spending his money to show off his appearance with his wealthy attire, and he has a certain attitude towards other people. The clerk, who's a poor man, scholarly, but maybe a little bit conceited as well in an intellectual way, as we all are as intellectuals. We're a bit snobbish about other people, even if we try not to be. That's part of the deal, I suppose, and so on. Okay, so these are 2 snapshots of people from medieval towns. Okay, so Friday we shall start looking at the problems, the calamities, as I've called them, of the 14th century, and Serkan will give a presentation about popes in trouble, and we'll have to sort out what's going on Friday, following Tuesday, for the other presentation. Monasteries, cathedral, schools, and so on. This is the reason why people often say, oh, the church had this terrible control over learning and seemed to want to keep everyone else stupid or whatever, rather than the fact that if the church wasn't doing that, then everyone would be stupid. But here at least was a small minority of people who had time and inclination to pass on the learning and so on, which is how I'd like to see it myself, rather than in a negative way. But there's no denying that, to a large extent, intellectual activity of one sort or another was going on in churches, and to a large extent therefore, but not exclusively, was focusing on one way or another religious issues, but not always, of course. However, Perhaps in the late 12th century and into the 13th century, a little bit earlier in one or two cases, we do then see the emergence of new intellectual centres, which are still, in one way or another, part of the church system in terms of its personnel, but are, on the other hand, to some degree, independent from church hierarchy. And these separate schools develop in different places, are the origins of what we call universities. Now, we mentioned the word universitas before, which Alp was mentioning that one earlier on. That's one of the terms. But again, like in the case of the guilds or whatever, there are various other words which were used. Studium is one of these. Collegium that I mentioned before. Facultas, faculty. They were all described in various ways, but today we use the concept of university as a way of kind of grouping them all together. So, the main distinction is not that somehow the universities were secular and were focusing on necessarily secular, non-religious things, because most of the people, or all the people in a sense, who were members of the university, whether they were the teachers or the students, were all part of the church hierarchy. Okay, then very quickly, let's just finish off before we delve into Jeff Chaucer again, with a few thoughts about universities. Since we are ourselves here gathered together at a modern university, let's have a look at the origins of that concept in medieval Europe as it was. Until about AD 1200, maybe a little bit before, okay, most learning, transmission of learning and education was primarily focused on religious institutions. Feel free to make any comments. I won't ask you to give a lecture now. We don't have the time either for you or me to go on long. But if you want to add anything else to what I'm saying, then we can kind of share it, because it would be nice to get your perspective. So by the late Middle Ages, we can kind of talk about universities, and there is a certain identity, a certain character which continues into the early modern period. Before then, when they emerged from in different places for different reasons and different ways. So, for example, in Italy, one of the earliest and most important, what we would call universities, perhaps as late as the end of the 11th century, was at Bologna, and this was particularly associated with the study of law, which is a little bit outside the focus of the church, but the church is interested in law as well. But it produced jurists who would work in the church, but might also work in, they were clergymen, they were clericos, clerics, which we get the English word clerk, okay? But they had their own separate association, legal identity. Okay, and that's the important thing which makes them different from a monastic school or a cathedral school, which was part of that church and was therefore controlled by that church, and so on. So it's their identity, it's their situation, legal situation, which is to some extent different from the others. Okay, one of you did the essay on universities? I can't remember who did the essay on universities. Is it he or she here? I don't remember who it was now. Obviously not. Alp, you gave a presentation a few years ago on universities. Is that right? Or for me, whatever. I don't want to put you on the spot and say, cast your mind back 3 years or however long it was, but